Hello and welcome to the agenda. I am Ajay Kaul. In this program today, we will discuss why reforms of the United Nations have become overdue and why India deserves a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. For how long will India be kept out of the decision-making structures of the United Nations? This blunt question was posed by Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the world community as he addressed the UN General Assembly. His question came against the backdrop of India's long-standing bid for permanent membership of the powerful UN Security Council. So why did he have to ask this question? What is preventing India from entry into the Security Council? We will analyze these and other questions in the agenda today. We have with us former diplomats, Ambassador Dr. Deepak Vora and Ambassador Ashok Sajanhar. But before we start our conversation, let us have a look at this report.
India has been waiting for a permanent seat in the powerful UN Security Council for decades now, and the impatience is growing. This impatience was reflected when Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a strong pitch with a direct question: for how long will India be kept out of the decision-making structures of the United Nations? PM Modi reminded the world that the faith and respect that the UN enjoys among the 1.3 billion people in India is unparalleled. He said India is a country which has lost a number of its brave soldiers in the course of maintaining peace under the UN mandate. And while seeing the contribution of India in UN, every India aspires for India's expanded role in the United Nations. Though he spoke about India's expanded role, he was clearly referring to the country's ambition of becoming the permanent member of the UN Security Council. India has made clear its bid for permanent membership at the UNSC. Most of the countries, including the permanent members of the UNSC, like the United States, Russia, Britain and France, have expressed open support for India's candidature. However, there has been no progress as it is being linked to the overall reform of the United Nations, which is also much overdue. A reform plan was set out by the then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in 2005. As part of the plan, he had proposed expansion of United Nations Security Council to 24 members from the present 5. However, some countries like Pakistan, Italy, Canada and Argentina got together to form a grouping called Uniting for Consensus. It suggested that the permanent membership should be retained at 5, while non-permanent member could be increased to 20 from the present 10. India, Germany, Japan and Brazil, all aspirant of the permanent membership at UN Security Council, had also formed a pressure group to push for reform of the world's body. But it did not make much progress. So, it now needs to be seen whether the UN reform will actually be undertaken, and if yes, then when. Bureau Report.
Now let's welcome our guests, Ambassador Vora from the US and Mr. Sajanhar. Welcome to the program, sirs.
Thank you.
So my first question is to Mr. Vora, since you are in America. So you heard Prime Minister speaking at the UNGA. Does it reflect impatience in India?
Thank you very much, Mr. Paul. Always a pleasure to interact with you, learn from you and from my distinguished colleague, Ambassador Ashok Sajanhar. You're absolutely right. I'm in New York, so forgive me. I'm wearing a scarf because it's 14 degrees outside, even though we have heating on inside. Yes, in many ways, the chill that we have in New York reflects the status of the United Nations. What Prime Minister noticed, I just point out that it is for the first time, and I say this with total sincerity, that I've heard a Prime Minister make a virtual address to the United Nations head of government and address in the brief virtual address every major issue that is bothering the United Nations, that is troubling it, because it's an organization that needs to do very deep introspection. That one basic question a country like India, which is a founding member of the United Nations, even though we were a colony at that time, how can that be outside the decision-making structures? The First World War created the League of Nations, Second World War created the United Nations, and today we have probably the biggest challenge, the Chinese virus or COVID-19, if you prefer, that the world faces in our century. And a country that produces the largest number of vaccines, that has always shared its ideas, its technology, its resources with the rest of the world, that has led by example, that has never given an example of its power, but has shown the power of its example. How can you keep that out of the most important, the most significant decision-making structure within the United Nations? I think that was a question that reflected not just the aspirations of 1.3 billion Indians, but of all the people who are not from the 5 permanent members, saying, why? Here is a country that is our friend, that has done so much. How come we are unable to depend on India to raise our voice, because other people in the permanent, in the Security Council, the permanent members have the right to veto any action that we take? It was a heartfelt question, and I'm afraid, sir, there is no easy answer to this unless the existing structures, because of the external shock that we are facing with the virus, those structures respond, those structures see that there is a tremendous need for reform. Otherwise, what we are going to have is a structure on top of a structure, on top of a structure, on top of a structure. Nothing is going to change. As the French say, la plus ça change, la plus c'est la même. He talked of India making sacrifices, our sons dying in peacekeeping operations. We have been outstanding in peacekeeping operations. He talked of women's empowerment. He's talked of the ending of open defecation. He has just shown that it is possible to achieve it, even if a country is not supposed to be very rich. Just the comprehensive national willpower of the people. Now we want to see this comprehensive national willpower to create not a United Nations in its present form, but perhaps an organization of equal nations.
Okay, let me turn to Mr. Sajjanhar now. I will ask you the same question with also views from, as Mr. Ambassador Vora mentioned. Is India's impatience growing, and why is India being kept out?
Well, two very important questions, Ajayji. And first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. It's always a pleasure to speak with you and interact with you.
Thank you, sir.
First, you mentioned that is India's impatience growing? You know, India has been speaking about it and negotiating about it, about an expansion of the UN Security Council for several decades. But there are vested interests, there are powerful countries which are quite satisfied and happy with the structures as they exist today. But these structures, as the Prime Minister himself said, they were created 75 years ago in 1945. The complexion and the issues and the challenges that faced the world in 1945 were quite different from the challenges that the world faces today. So if the structures have, if the issues have changed, if the challenges have changed, if the problems have changed, you cannot deal with them with the same structures that you had put in place at that time. At that time, there were just about 50 members of the United Nations. Today, there are 193, about 4 times. So you cannot have a Security Council. Of course, there are other institutions, whether it is the General Assembly, whether it is the ECOSOC, whether it is the UN Secretary General's mandate and responsibilities and activities. Many others need also reform. But I think it is the UN Security Council that really needs reform. And you know, 2 points that the Prime Minister made. One, he said that there is a crisis of confidence.
Right.
Crisis of confidence because United Nations has not changed. The second thing he said is that as far as COVID-19 is concerned, this is the worst crisis that has hit the world for the last more than 100 years. But the United Nations has been missing, and I think all of us know that because it has to do with China as my distinguished friend Ambassador Deepak Gora mentioned that it emanated from Wuhan, it emanated from China. So when it was raging at its worst, at its highest in March, China was the president of the UN Security Council, and it said that this is a health issue. It is not a peace and security issue. So there was no meeting that could take place in March. When it did take place in April, then also it couldn't do anything. So what the Prime Minister said is this biggest challenge, and the United Nations is missing. So I think if the credibility of the United Nations has to be restored, there have to be changes, and the most important thing is the UN Security Council. Now you said, why is India being kept out? Well, 4 out of the 5 permanent members who have veto authority, they are supportive of India's increased role and permanent membership of the UN Security Council. It's only China is not there, and this is a very strange system which has continued, that any one country can put veto in front of this any proposal, any suggestion, and it will not be taken forward. And I think under the current circumstances, giving this, the United Nations speaks about democracy in the world, and here in its own working, it's a very non-democratic institution, because it has differentiated out of 193, 5 countries have veto power, 188 do not have veto power. So there is a distinction between the haves and the have-nots. And I think this is patently unpalatable. It is not acceptable. So I think we will have to find a creative solution as to how to get around this veto, meaning even on simple things like, let's say, Masood Azhar, when we wanted to get him designated as an international terrorist, we were not able to get that done,
right,
because for 10 years, because China stood in the way. So I think we really need to find a way, and if we are able to find a way, a creative way around the veto of China, because otherwise we need a 2/3 majority in the UN General Assembly, which is 128 out of 193 countries. And I'm sure we will get this. We've just seen for a non-permanent seat, out of 192, we were able to get 184 votes.
Right.
So that should not be a problem. I think it is only one issue, that is the veto of China, and we really have to get around it in some creative manner.
Ambassador Sajanar, if you talked about powerful countries, out of 5, 4 support India, and if we talk about America, US initially was hesitant in supporting India, because I think they wanted from Asia, they wanted only one country, that was Japan. They were supporting them, and then hesitantly they supported India also. So I feel US is not really into it. They are just making lip service. It may be my view. And what do you think about it?
No, I would not go with your view. You see, after all, President Barack Obama, when he came here in November 2010 and speaking in the parliament, he gave this commitment that United States is fully behind India's permanent membership of the UN Security Council as and when the expansion takes place. And you see, on Saturday, the Prime Minister himself mentioned, we account for about 18% of the world population.
Right.
We have given the highest number of people for the UN peacekeeping forces. You are showing images here. We have sacrificed the highest number of casualties as far as the UN peacekeeping operations are concerned. We've taken a large number of initiatives, whether it is the International Day of Non-Violence, International Day of Yoga, International Solar Alliance, resilient disaster management structures. So a number of initiatives have been taken, and whatever India does, it has a huge impact on the world. So as far as US, your question was to the US, both President Obama, the former president, and President Trump, both of them have said categorically that they would like India to become a permanent member as and when the expansion takes place. So I would like to take them at face value. Our relationship with the United States has grown very significantly. You know that Obama had called it the defining partnership of the 21st century.
Right.
And Prime Minister Modi had called it an indispensable partnership. So I don't really have much concern or doubts that United States will not be supportive of India for a permanent membership when the time arrives.
Okay, Ambassador Vora, if we talk about various proposals which have been put forth for the reforms or maybe expansion of United Security Council, long back in 2005, I think Kofi Annan had proposed that it should be expanded to 24 members, and then there was some unity for consensus. Our friends Pakistan joined hands with Italy, and I think scuttled the process. Am I right?
You're absolutely right, Mr. Kaul. 75 साल पुरानी कोई चीज आपके घर में है तो कबाड़ी वाला भी नहीं उसको ले. अगर आप उसको रिफर्बिश ना करें, बोले भाई ये कोई नई चीज है, देखिए this is something you take this, nobody is going to be interested in that. $500 billion have been in the United Nations from the time. 1200 countries around the world. 100 देश हैं which have 10 UN country offices. Is this some kind of the basic issue today? Let me put it very bluntly. The United Nations in its present form is an unending scandal masquerading as ever. It has grown so big that at times it seems to be working against itself. Let me also ask you, my distinguished colleague, Pastor Ashok Sajana, whose knowledge exceeds mine. Let's assume for a moment, let's fantasize that it gets into the Security Council, the President becomes a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and that 6 countries have a veto. The term veto is not in the UN Charter, sir. It talks about concurring votes. Basically, if even one of them says no, if the whole world says, for example, putting this very bluntly and basically, the whole world says Jesus Christ was a great guy, or the permanent member says no, that's it, the resolution will come. Let's assume for a moment that, and we want to say that terrorism should end, and China gets up and says, where are we, sir? This is the issue that has, somehow it has become कि अगर हम UN Security Council में आ गए एक बार तो सारी दुनिया का भला होगा. Of course we try our best. As long as the attitudes of the members do not change, I do not see that there will be any great.
I think your voice is cracking, Ambassador Vora. We'll get back to you. Till then, I'll go back to Ambassador Sajanhar. So, Ambassador Sajanhar, I'll talk about G4 that India had proposed. I mean, had formed that grouping of Germany, Japan, and Brazil, and there was some momentum earlier, and then it lost momentum. And in fact, at one point of time, I remember India was even ready to give up the veto power. I mean, there was a proposal that maybe for 10 years we should not have veto power and we should get into somehow into as a permanent member. So, how do you see that situation? That G4 is now, I think, nowhere.
No, I think the G4 definitely does meet around the.
Yeah, I know that they held a meeting recently, but I think the momentum that I'm talking about is nowhere now.
Okay, let me put it this way. You know that there was a high point, as you mentioned, at around 2005, 2006. And at that time, the problem was that the 50 plus countries of Africa, they were not on the same page, you know, because there were some suggestions that were made in terms of, one permanent member from Africa, one non-permanent member, in terms of the expansion that takes place. But I think they had some different ideas. So, if out of 190 or so you take out 50 seats, then you will not be able to get the 2/3 majority that we are looking at. So there was that problem. But I think this whole issue did get a shot in the arm also more recently. You would recall that when the Prime Minister spoke in 2014, his first address to the UN General Assembly, and the next year was going to be the 70th anniversary, and at that time also he had said that this occasion of the 70th anniversary of the United Nations should be utilized for expansion of the UN Security Council and for reform of the United Nations system. That unfortunately has not happened exactly because of the reason that I mentioned, that is the objections by China. And of course of some of the other countries, what is known as the Cafe Ole group. You have Pakistan next to India, you have Japan next, you have South Korea next to Japan, you have Italy next to Germany, and you have Argentina next to Brazil.
Yeah.
So as a result of that, it did not. But then we were able to make a significant progress because we got a text on the basis of which negotiations could take place.
Right.
And I think that text we were able to get, there was I forget his name, it was a Jamaican ambassador who was the chair of this negotiating committee. And he was able to put forward about 2 years ago this negotiating text. And it was hoped that if we have a text-based negotiations, we would be able to make significant progress. But then again, it is the same politics, Ajay, that has come in. It is China which is sort of, placing obstacles. You see, meaning it's standard practice. What has happened as far as India's membership of the Nuclear Suppliers Group is concerned?
Right.
It is only China. China is not a member of the 3 other export control arrangements, whether it is Australia Group, whether it is MTCR, whether it is Wassenaar arrangement. So India has become a member of those without any problem. It's only NSG where China is a member that it is standing in the way. So wherever China is there...
Since you, Ambassador Sajjan, since you mentioned about NSG, I covered that. I remember it was China was holding to the last, but it was American push which forced them to then really agree, isn't it? So American push came in help.
No, you are mentioning about the NSG.
NSG 2008, yeah.
No, NSG, India is still not a member, as you know. So we still have to, jump.
Not as a member, I am talking about the waiver, one-time waiver we got.
Waiver, yes. But that is at the IAEA in 2008, in September, when we were getting a unique for the India-US nuclear deal, and to get a one-time waiver so that India could engage in export and import of nuclear technology and material. You are very right that China would not say anything itself, but it put up countries like Ireland, like Sweden, like Norway to ask questions. When their questions were answered, still China would not agree. And that time you would recall that President George W. Bush picked up the telephone, spoke to Hu Jintao, who was the Chinese president, and asked him to sort of, to dilute their objection. I still remember the next day was a Saturday. There was the technical issue, mechanism of freezing the clock. So the clock was not moving forward. And on Saturday morning, we had this meeting. China abstained itself.
I was privileged to cover that meeting in Vienna at that time.
Okay, good. So let me end my intervention. I know Ambassador Deepak Bora wants to speak. Short point I was making is, wherever China is there, it will put obstacles in the way of India, because it does not want India to play its due role in global affairs. So that's why I said we have to have a creative solution to get out of China's veto. Please.
Right, Ambassador Bora, you wanted to say something. I think we interrupted you earlier.
Yeah, Mr. Cole, were you able to hear my earlier intervention when we spoke?
Somewhat, because your voice was cracking. So now I think we are clear.
Okay, if you can hear me clearly, the point that I was only simply trying to make, sir, is that an issue, what you call a challenge or a problem, created by a particular mindset, the solution cannot be found by that mindset. Somehow the heaven for us, somehow the ultimate goal is permanent membership of the UN Security Council. It's very clear, sir, that the term veto does not exist in the UN Charter. They talk about concurring votes. Let's have a situation, let's think of a fantasy where we are the 6th permanent member of the Security Council. We turn around and say there's genocide going on in country X, so we should intervene. But China, as is its wont, does not give a concurring vote, which is the UN Charter. There's nothing we can do. My basic view, sir, and which upsets me and which concerns me, that a 75-year-old organization, how do you reform it? It's a fossil. It's a dinosaur. There are people sitting there who do not want any change, and many of them are permanent members of the UN Security Council. Today, sir, if a new organization was to be set up and it said, which are the 4 countries that you think are the most powerful, leading in the world, well, you would go to the United States, you would say China, you would say India, you would probably say Japan. Europe is missing in action. Europe is not relevant anymore. Right. So what are France and Britain doing there in the UN Security Council? These are issues to be raised. What Prime Minister said He talked about COVID, said the UN was nowhere around. He's talked about bread and butter issues, sir. He's telling the UN without saying so and without naming any country, look within, spending $500 billion. What have you achieved? What is the world a better place than it was 75 years ago? There are more wars being fought. There may not have been world wars. And I can only quote Dag Hammarskjöld, which is a very nebulous way of complimenting the UN. All right, we have not been able to take mankind to heaven. He was the tragic second secretary. But at least we have prevented them from going to hell. Now, if you have this kind of an opinion about the United Nations, I'm afraid it's not going to have a very bright future. Instead of United Nations, let's have equal nations. Let's get rid of the veto once and for all, sir. There are 193 equal member states of the international system. Let each have a voice. Let's not get distracted. UN Security Council, UN Security Council. It's not going to happen in the present form. So let's just take away the veto from the concurring vote from the 5 permanent members and let's see what happens.
So, Ambassador Vora, if we talk about UNSC particularly, which we call very powerful, but we have seen it is very ineffective. It passes resolutions which are not implemented by countries. We take example of Pakistan. Hafiz Saeed, he is a globally designated terrorist. He is roaming freely. Dawood Ibrahim, Hafiz Masood Azhar. So when it comes to implementation, it has no teeth. UN Security Council is not able to implement. No country, I mean, particularly if you take example of Pakistan, it doesn't listen. So what do you do then?
You are absolutely right, sir. That's a no-brainer. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, you have said it so succinctly, so brilliantly that it's pretty useless. You know, this is something that we used to say that in the time of the Soviet Union, that when the Soviet Union and the USA, and I love this quotation, when they agreed, the UN was pointless. When they disagreed, the UN was powerless. And at all other times, the UN was useless. That is the reality today between the United States and China. Kuch nahi hota hai, sir, because they all have their competing interests. And today, anything that the US wants, China will oppose it. Anything that China wants, the US present administration will oppose it. So where are we? We are in stasis. We are in intellectual paralysis. Therefore, we need to come out with some very creative ideas. And I believe the Prime Minister is saying that the biggest challenge, sir, it's an existential challenge. 1 million people have died because of the Chinese virus. He said, where are you guys? There is that weird health organization, the son-in-law of China is the Director General. First he said, oh no, there's no such thing, there's no virus. Then he said there's no human-to-human transmission. Then whatever the Chinese said, he parroted that. Where are we, sir?
Right.
Let's get real. I mean, there are 7.5 billion people whose lives are at stake. Let's set up an organization that responds to challenges, that doesn't live in the past.
So I'll ask the same question to Ambassador Sajjan. Like UNSC, we call it powerful, but it is not powerful in effect, in implementation. Resolutions are not implemented at all. Isn't it?
Absolutely. I think what the Prime Minister did was that he showed the mirror to the United Nations, to the UN Security Council. Because basically, again, you know, meaning if they are changing their stand, you see in 2014, Ajay, we had the Ebola crisis.
Right.
It was of a much lesser dimension and intensity and range and scope of countries that it covered. But still, the UN Security Council met immediately. And they said that it is an issue that affects global peace and security. And they took measures. They put a $1 billion fund to deal with it. But this time, as I mentioned earlier, China said, no, it's a health issue. It's not a... So it is basically the vested interest of these countries. And I think the UN General Assembly and the other countries. But then we also need to realize that countries which are able to put these spokes in the wheel, they either themselves are powerful. You see what China has done in the South China Sea. The Permanent Court of Arbitration has said that all your arguments are worthless, are useless. We reject them. But what does China do? China just tears up that judgment of the Permanent Court of Arbitration.
They don't accept it, yeah.
And they throw it in the dust paper bin. So this is what, because either they are powerful themselves, or like Pakistan, they have the backing of another powerful country. That's why they will not follow it. And so that's what happens. But I think there are instruments now, let's say like the Financial Action Task Force. So we use that instrumentality, at least try to push Pakistan on that. And let us see, at least it makes it, run around a little bit and at least show that it is taking some action.
Right.
It might not be very worthwhile, it might be only superficial, it might be just papering over the cracks, but at least it makes it nervous and investments are not coming into Pakistan. So I think we have to use all instrumentalities available to us to put pressure on these countries who do not follow what really needs to be done.
Right, Ambassador Vora, our time is running out. Last question to you. So, shall we sum up that UNSC is a hostage to powerful countries like America and China particularly? Russia now has no value as that. Is that correct to say?
Oh, absolutely correct to say it's being held hostage. As of July 2020, Russia or the USSR used the veto 116 times, United States 81 times, UK 29, France 16, China 16, always in cases involving their own interest. I mean, UN Security Council के अंदर you are using the veto to block something that will benefit all mankind. This system cannot continue, sir. We are living in a real world. The United Nations continues to survive and thrive, I'm afraid, in a fantasy world. Prime Minister of India, Sri Narendra Bhai Modi, has held up a mirror saying, when we needed you most, where were you? UN was missing in action. इससे बड़ी indictment और क्या हो सकती है, sir?
Right. So the mirror has been shown to the UN. We hope that UN will wake up and maybe realize and reform. But thank you both of you for participating in this debate.
Thank you.
This is all in the agenda today. Thanks for watching. I will be back with another important topic tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.